Hi students, welcome to Year 11 Biology and Module 3, Biological Diversity. This is video number 5 and we're going to be focusing on structural adaptations. Our learning intention for this video is that you would be able to examine the structural adaptations of organisms that increase their ability to survive in their environment. Now that's a very broad learning intention. There's lots of different types of adaptations and we want to just quickly introduce some of those and then just pick and choose a couple of little examples to get you started, and obviously we'll look at a lot more in the classroom. So the first thing we probably need to do is to define what adaptations are, and adaptations are characteristics that increase the survival and reproductive chances of an organism in its environment. Obviously, we need to link this back to what we've already talked about a little bit in terms of Darwin's theory of natural selection, where we need some variation in the population, some sort of a selecting agent, and also for any of those advantages that are built into the genetic code to be passed on into future generations. And that's how the populations, or at least the gene pool, can shift over time to favour certain types of genes and certainly certain types of expressions of genes over others. So most of what we do with our look at adaptations is we kind of look at them a little bit in retrospect. That is, we look at how organisms are currently adapted to the environments that they find themselves in, particularly in terms of both the biotic and abiotic selection factors that are part of those different environments, in order for us to study what it is that gives certain organisms an advantage. So that's what we're going to do here. We're going to just pick out a couple of examples and see if we can identify how those particular adaptations help an organism to survive. Before we look specifically at structural, it's worth just mentioning at this point that we'll actually be looking at 3 different videos in this little mini series, if you like, in biological diversity, looking at adaptations. The first one, this one, we'll look at structural adaptations. And structural adaptations are the physical characteristics of the organism. Most of the time, you can think of that if you can dissect an organism and hold something in your hand. You may not want to, but if you could, that's a structure. That's a particular physical component of the organism, and we can recognize that as having a particular function. A second type of adaptation are physiological, and physiological are the way that the organism's body functions. So some of the internal processes that are part of organisms can come under this category of physiological. And then the third type of adaptations are the way that the organism acts. Are there certain ways or certain behaviours that we can analyse of different types of organisms that give them some sort of an advantage in the environment, and from that advantage that allows them not only to survive but then to pass their genes on to future generations? So that's the context that we're looking at in terms of adaptations. So let's go on and have a look at a couple of structural ones. As I mentioned, what's really important is that you look at a range of different types of adaptations and see if you can match those to the specific selection pressures that were placed on populations by different types of environments. So we've just got a few selections here to have a look at. One of the interesting structural features of a wombat is that it has a backwards facing pouch. Now, classic kangaroos have the little joey's head sitting out of the pouch, just opening towards the head. Now, for an animal that's a burrower or a digger like a wombat, a forward-facing pouch would mean that every time that the animal was digging, the pouch would fill up with sand, soil, rock. That's not good for the animal, and it's also not good for the joey. So we see in wombats, and we also see in other organisms like the marsupial mole, that the pouch actually opens towards the back of the animal rather than towards the front. That is a structure. It's something that we can see, and it's something that we can conclude was probably a result of the fact that these animals are diggers and they do burrow underground, and therefore a forward-facing pouch would be a distinct disadvantage in that circumstance. We're probably aware that seals like this little fur seal, have layers of blubber, and blubber is a really good structure that allows the animal to be more insulated in a colder environment, in an aquatic environment. The temperature fluctuations are less than they are on land, but the temperatures in some of the environments that seals live in is very, very cold, so they need some sort of additional insulation for that purpose. And likewise, the feathers of an emu perform a similar kind of a function. Feathers are a great insulator, and they are used in emus for a similar sort of reason. Compare the feathers of the emu to the feathers of the peacock. Now here the feathers are serving a completely different purpose. Here they are about display. They're about mating, or at least attracting a mate. And the peacock's a really interesting one because it gives us a bit of an idea of the interplay between potentially multiple selection pressures that can act on organisms, or at least populations of organisms, over time. Now, obviously, having a very big and impressive display makes you more likely to attract a mate, but it's probably also more likely to attract a predator. And if you're trying to drag a very large tail around behind you, being able to escape from predators is going to be a little bit more difficult as well. So often we find some of these different selection pressures acting almost in opposite directions to moderate the types of adaptations that we see in different populations in response to each of these different types of pressures. The last two diagrams or pictures that I've put on this slide for you give you a really nice contrast in leaf size. As I've mentioned plenty of times already, surface area to volume is a critical concept for biologists. And here we see two great examples of two plants in completely different environments with completely different types of leaves. The Xanthorrhoea, or the grass tree on the left, is this one here, that's Xanthorrhoea. It's a grass plant, a grass tree, and it has very thin leaves. You can see it's in a pretty dry environment where there's a potential for a lot of water to be lost from the leaves. And so these leaves are very long and very thin in order to try and minimize. They'll also be quite a hard leaf as well in order to try and minimize water loss. On the other side are elephant ears, and these are plants that live in a tropic environment. You probably could have guessed that without me telling you, because they're massive. They are huge, very big surface area. This is about capturing as much light as possible. You can see the deep green color in these leaves as well, which indicates that they're full of chloroplasts, which again is going to maximize the rate of photosynthesis that can occur in these plants as they maximize the amount of light that they can get for that purpose. So these are all structures. They're all things we could hold in our hand. They're all things that we can look at, and they're all things that we can conclude will have given each of these individual organisms some specific advantage in the environments in which they live. But structural adaptations are just one type of adaptation, and we're going to look at two others in the next two videos. Thanks for watching.